For the first time ever, we have been able to learn not just about the Mistress of Evil herself, but the creatures that she derived from and how they shaped her into one of the strongest entities to have ever existed. Hello, I'm Isaac from Watso Videos, where we discuss fun topics for fun people. I'm focused on spreading magic by examining Disney, so if you are new here, consider following my adventures on Instagram and subscribing. Now, this set may seem a little weird or a little familiar depending on who you are, but don't worry, I'm just doing my own thing, spreading some magic and getting excited about more knowledge on one of the most iconic villains to have ever lived. Except, of course, Maleficent isn't portrayed as a villain in her own films, but much more of a protective, retaliant, and forceful guardian over her home and the ones she loved. Other than the degrading properties of iron, when Maleficent unleashes her full potential, nothing can stop her, and we find out that's because of who she descends from. From the film Maleficent, we already had an understanding that Maleficent was a unique fairy in her home of the Moors, whose parents had died early into her life. We also had the knowledge that she could heal and communicate with the nature around her, transform creatures, fly above the land, and cast magic, including curses, onto others. But there was one more thing that Maleficent could do that even she was unaware of just yet. First, she had to uncover who she was and where her kind derived from. Now, we'll be getting into spoilers from Maleficent, the Mistress of Evil, so if you'd like to stay clear of all the story elements from those events, definitely go watch it and come back to my discussion on what we learned. The film is an exciting adventure with rich lore and even has emotional moments that made my girlfriend literally cry. What we discovered from the Mistress of Evil and discussions from the creators of that film is the untold story of Maleficent's fairy kind that is known as the Dark Fays. By defining dark and fey, we are able to see that these are creatures who exist in the absence of light and give an impression of vague unworldliness. But where did these fairies come from? It turns out that all dark fae originated from a single island thousands of years ago, but had to flee this home when the island exploded like a giant volcano, which subsequently forced these fairies to spread around the world. From the separation of the dark fays, this led them to grow communities in different parts of the world and resulted in them rising to create 4 different types of fairies. Quickly, the Dark Fays became a very diversified bunch. There were the Desert Fae, who had wings with colors that evoke their sandy environment, who wear clothing that appear to be bleached and rough and cracked. Then there was the Tundra Fae, who merged to become all ice, with a palette of white and blue and grays. In addition, the Jungle Fae were a denomination that had the aesthetic of diverse colors and radiance, and finally, there was the type of Dark Fae that Maleficent was, the green and earth-focused Forest Fae. Born in the enchanted forest kingdom of the Moors, it made a lot of sense to me that Maleficent would come from this type of Dark Fae. But unfortunately, there was a problem for the Dark Faes that had spread around the world: the emergence of humans. See, at the peak of the Dark Fae's existence, they were everywhere and arose to become a type of battle folk who transformed themselves into high-class warriors. They could not be avoided by any creature, which inevitably frightened the territorial and defensive humans, for it was clear with their magic and might that one of these fairies could easily outmatch a single human. Thus, humans began to attack, trap, and destroy the Dark Faes through the centuries after the humans rose. Tactically, the humans eradicated them and forced almost all of these fairies back to the island for which they came from, using their tools and weapons. Due to cruel and aggressive humans, the Dark Faes were turned from dominant entities to refugees. While the Faes had grown their own civilizations and communities apart from one another after the original destruction of their island, in the faces of the threat, they united as one people to protect each other. Together, these fairies constructed an almost hive on the island, leading them to recreate the different factions' home environments in hopes of preserving their people. But most of these warrior fairies did not want to keep themselves alive, but thrive in the lands they had once settled on. Around the time of Maleficent's life, the wise forest fae Kiezl arose to become their leader, preaching the desire for peace. But many also banded behind the war-focused desert fae called Barna, who believed war was the only way to save their kind. While the debate on how to proceed to keep the dark phase from becoming extinct, some of the last known fairies from this species that existed outside of the island gave birth to the young Maleficent, who was given a strength unlike the rest of her kind. The Maleficent series of films explains the Mistress of Evil's unstoppable power comes from her bloodline specifically and directly tied to that of the Phoenix. I'm sorry, Mr. Bob, not like you. The one Maleficent came from was a whole lot bigger, much more ancient, and possibly even more powerful. I'm sorry, Mr. Bob, I know you're a strong guy. If you are unfamiliar with the mythological phoenix, they are a formidable bird connected to fire that are able to be born again out of the ashes of their predecessors, making them practically immortal, magical creatures that bring about renewal. They are wicked cool birds that you may have seen once or twice in a lot of fantasy stories, who astonishingly were integrated into the Maleficent story and provided one especially unimaginable ability to her. The Phoenix gave the fairy an unprecedented power to rise from her own death and transform into the massive Phoenix herself, with increased strength, speed, and dominance over her enemies while retaining her memories and appearance. But that's not only what the Phoenix gave Maleficent. The Phoenix ancestor of the Dark Fairy in part contributed to the reasons Maleficent was born with more magical power than the rest of her species, could dominate with skill on the battlefield, and would one day be instrumental in ending the conflict between humans and the Dark Phase. But all of that would take place many years after Maleficent's birth. First, Maleficent would need to suffer from the loss of her parents, be heartbroken, learn to love, and find the rest of her kind. She would need to learn to become protective yet empathetic, strong yet delicate, and determined to stand her ground from anyone who would oppose her. Through the strength of her ancestors, including both the Dark Fae and the Phoenix, she would transform into an individual who would become known as a being of evil, even though she had the power to restore order and peace. But what do you think? Do you like that an iteration of Maleficent's origins have been explored, and are you hyped that she is tied to the Phoenix? Let me know what you think in the comments, and after that, check out my podcast Following Dreams, where I interview fun people like the Tangled the series creator, Jack Kendall from DSNY Newscast, and most recently, Mr. Cheesy Pop. If you'd like to continue to see more magical discussions like this one, then don't forget to click that subscribe button and the beautiful bell if you're new. Thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon who are amazing supporters of my videos, and finally, as always, thanks for watching and have a magical day.